As an artist, I find myself drawn to painting nature, wildlife, other animals, and more recently, landscapes. So, painting portraits of people is something that I don't really have a huge amount of experience in. Despite this, I find myself intrigued by portrait painting. There's just something quite magical about having the ability to capture an emotion or to tell a story through compelling portraiture. I've attempted just a handful of portraits over the past couple of years, and I have always found them to be incredibly difficult to complete. Perhaps if you're an artist watching this, you might have a particularly challenging subject of your own. Let me know in the comments. Is there a type of painting you struggle with, or perhaps that you avoid altogether? I think my difficulty with portrait painting is in part due to a lack of experience. If you go months between painting a particular subject, it's going to be much more challenging when you eventually come back to it, having had absolutely no practice in between. But I do feel like there's something more than that, an added layer of difficulty when it comes to painting people. Maybe it's just me, maybe I'm making excuses for myself, but I think there's something different when it comes to painting a portrait of a person. I was working on a landscape a couple of weeks ago with a flock of sheep in the foreground, and in order to achieve success with that painting, all I needed to really do was depict accurate looking sheep with the right lighting, the right proportions, and with the right colours. It didn't really matter if I didn't capture the exact likeness of my subject. I didn't need the sheep to look like the exact sheep in the picture. As long as it looked like a sheep, it would do the job. I realize I've said sheep a lot of times now, so we'll move back to the portrait. I don't think the same principle quite works for portrait painting. It's not enough to paint an accurate depiction of a generic person and hope for the best. You have to capture that exact likeness, a real sense of the individual sitting in front of you or in a photograph. I find myself adding layer upon layer of detail in order to try and capture this elusive likeness. And this ultimately leads to a lot of reworking and eventually overworking almost every single portrait attempt I have ever made. Each painting takes an inordinate amount of time, and it feels so much more like a battle than a relaxing creative experience. As the early spring weather has been a little poor and a little bit rainy and not very conducive to outdoor landscape studies, I decided this would be the perfect opportunity to practice a few self-portraits. Painting my own face eased a lot of the pressure and allowed me freedom to experiment without the worry I may be unintentionally insulting my subject if I didn't achieve the most flattering likeness. The only person I could really upset here would be myself, and I decided to cut myself some slack. The portrait you're watching unfold began with a grisaille underpainting. I thought I should attempt something new in order to try and avoid making the same mistakes I've made in previous portrait paintings, and an underpainting like this is something I haven't really tried before. This black and white layer I think was probably my favourite part of the entire process. It was lovely being able to focus on the values with no additional complications from the use of colour. However, I quickly found myself falling back into bad habits in the subsequent colour layers. I just didn't use the grisaille to the fullest potential, to the extent that it eventually got ignored pretty much altogether. It was like I took everything I knew about oil painting and deliberately tried to ignore every single part of it. I used brushes which were too small, I got too detailed too quickly, I forgot the importance of the values, and I overblended, muddying a lot of my colours. Don't get me wrong, it's not that I completely dislike this painting. I think there is a bit of a likeness there, and I know that I put a lot of effort into it. It's just not really the painting I set out to create. I think this was just a case of I started out with good intentions and then didn't really have the skill to be able to develop this painting in the way that I wanted to. This is something that I come across quite a bit being a self-taught artist. Sometimes I know what I do wrong, but I don't really understand what I need to do in order to make it better. I ended up feeling quite frustrated with this painting because I knew it was going in a direction that I didn't want to go in, but I wasn't quite sure how to turn it around. My initial plan was to do an extra layer on top of that and really refine the detail, but at this stage, on the third day, I felt so frustrated with it that it didn't really seem like something that I wanted to do. And I think it's important to be excited about your painting, especially if you're trying to develop a skill that you're not so comfortable with. If you're not enjoying the process, it's gonna seem like really hard work. And I felt if I could just get this painting to a level where I could call it finished, even if it wasn't as detailed as I wanted it to be, then that would be success in itself, and I'd be able to put it aside and move on to my next self-portrait practice. So once this was completed, I decided to take a bit of a break. This was actually planned. It wasn't an unintended side effect of not liking the painting. I went on a holiday with my dog, I took long walks, and I watched a lot of reruns of Portrait Artist of the Year, and eventually came back feeling really invigorated and excited to paint. I did my next self-portrait away from the camera to see if that made a difference. I don't know if any of you artists out there find the same thing, but I know if I'm ever recording for Instagram or YouTube, I never paint as well as I do when I'm being completely unobserved. I don't know, maybe it's just me or maybe that's a thing. But I wanted to include this because I feel like I had a bit of a breakthrough moment here. I tried to keep things loose. I made a real conscious effort not to overwork the detail. I approached it in what I felt was a completely different way, reducing the contrast between the lightest and darkest areas of the face and using a larger brush than I really felt comfortable with. I really liked the end result of this, and I felt like this was a breakthrough moment for me. I wanted to take that confidence into my next piece, and I'll share with you some of the changes I made in order to help me achieve success. By this point, I was a little bit fed up of painting my face. I didn't feel like it was very interesting and the composition wasn't great, so I was looking for something to make it a little bit more compelling. I decided to include my dog because this still had to be a self-portrait for the purpose of the exercise, but I really liked the connection in this photo, and I felt like it added a much needed narrative to the painting, which becomes a bit more obvious towards the end of this piece. I think this stands out to me as one of my favorites because of that, so I'm really glad I made that decision to change things up a little bit. The second thing I tried to do to make this process a bit easier was to work on a smaller scale. Now, this might not be helpful to every artist, and I think a more appropriate tip would probably be to work at a scale that you're most comfortable with. I've always preferred to work smaller. When I work large, I never mix enough paint and I struggle to cover the canvas, so I feel a little bit more familiar working on this kind of scale. This painting was perhaps a little bit too tiny. My second portrait was probably a better size. But by doing this, I was forced to choose what detail I wanted to include. Adding absolutely everything would have turned this into an incredibly cluttered painting, so the small scale really helped me to achieve some of the looseness I've been striving for. I always strive for loose paintings and I hardly ever achieve it, so I was really strict with myself during this painting. I began with larger brushes and only used detail brushes right at the very end. I also tried to look at the painting as a whole rather than focusing in on one small section at a time from the beginning. I didn't begin with a detailed sketch, and I think that allowed me freedom to find the face as I worked, which was a really interesting way of working. And I also tried not to enlarge the photo I was working from, and that was probably the most useful bit of advice for me during this. I painted only what I could see from a distance. I think when you're working from a photo, there's always that temptation to zoom in for that extra detail, but I really didn't want to do that this time, and I feel like that worked. For this painting and my second one, I worked on oil painting paper rather than canvas. The paint was much smoother to apply, and I enjoyed the new effects I was able to work into this piece as a result. I still might go back to canvas. I'm not saying that paper works better. I think the benefit here came from the change in the texture, which allowed me to explore new ideas with less of a temptation to fall back into bad habits. So in summary, I just really worked hard to approach this in a different way to how I normally attempt portrait paintings. I have tried that method lots of times, and I've always struggled to be successful or to create a decent likeness without spending days and sometimes weeks trying to get there. This was a really nice opportunity to do something a bit different, and I'm really pleased with how it turned out. I felt a lot of freedom in creating self-portraits instead of working on commissions for people. There was no expectation that it had to be a certain level, so I felt free to push the boundaries and to try things that I wouldn't necessarily try otherwise. I really enjoyed painting on a smaller scale. I like the loose feel to it, and this is something I'd like to work a little bit more on in the future. I think this is a really good start in beginning to develop a style, which is something I've been trying to do for years. So the fact I feel a little bit closer to that at the end of this process makes me feel like it was all worthwhile. This painting is by no means perfect. I definitely muddied some of the colours along the way, and I perhaps overworked the face a little bit with it being such a small size. But it's a really great start, and it makes me excited to paint again. I'm really looking forward to what I'll be creating next. And I really enjoyed this process, especially considering it didn't start out so great with the first one. It's been really nice to see how my paintings developed. Although I've only attempted 3 self-portraits during this practice, I already feel more confident in my work. I really hope you have found this video helpful. Please leave me a comment, and if you enjoyed this, click the like button and subscribe for more art-related content. Thank you for joining me for this video, and I'll see you again next time.